Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salam, hello, peace to you all. Welcome to the program, the second episode in our continuing series on the names of God. I'm Adnan Hussein, co-host with my friend and colleague and co-host Marc Applebaum. Marc, how are you doing?
Great. Excited to continue the conversation.
Yeah, me too. I mean, you had mentioned to me that after watching back that you felt really good about that first episode and what we're trying to do here. And, I'm also very excited. And we've had some good feedback already, and we might have a chance to get to comments at the end and deal with some of the interesting questions that people posed on the video comments section. And I just want to say to listeners and watchers, we welcome that. So we'd love to have that interaction. But, I also have been feeling a little, the weight or making it feel weighty to be entering into the next episode after, a very introductory discussion where we kind of introduced ourselves and why we care about the names and what we think they might be valuable for our audience. We're now starting to get more into the substantive components of it. And I, definitely have had my qualms about, well, what do I really have to say about this? And so on. And I'm wondering how you've been feeling too, both in terms of your positive reaction and reception to our first episode, but now we're about to embark, I think, more substantially into the names.
Yeah, I think the first thing that made me the happiest is that people I heard from were picking up on the quality and the openness of the exchange we're having about this topic. And that's my biggest priority is to speak in that both together in a way that's intimate, but also opens this topic up in the freest way possible. So that's what I'm here for. And as far as the, jumping into the pool this time together. So I think we were both reminded that both Ghazali and Tilimsani in his book on the names, and he's one of the early Akbari Sufi commentators on the names. Both of them position themselves in a very careful way. I mean, in fact, one has the impression from Ghazali in his book that he really would rather not write the book.
Yeah, we definitely have to talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot involved for them getting into this, and in our own way for us too.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think in a way I felt better about my hesitations and my concern to be careful, or, if there's self-doubt in what one feels like they have to say about such an awesome topic. It's really more a recognition for me of how important this is to me, that I, would want to give fully of myself, but also, of course, feel like there have been so many previous commentators of deep erudition, of great meditative concentration, of wholeheartedness, that have already trod along this path. And so following along with them is, and also trying to add something new in terms of perspective or relevance, in making it personal and available in different ways than the tradition maybe imagined its audience to be originally. That's kind of an awesome task. But then I was heartened by the sense of reluctance in a way, or at least of cautious and seeking aid. Okay, so I guess that's another kind of
Yeah.
component of it that I found interesting. That's a classical tradition that in a religious text treatise, whether it's a commentary on the Qur'an or a theological treatise or a book of law or a mystical, account, of course, there's always going to be some standard formulas for beginning, which are invocation, prayer,
Uh-huh.
usually, of course, also some statement of love for the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him. And In many cases, there are, of course, and this is in medieval writing, maybe across the Mediterranean world, is the humility topos. Okay, the sort of, oh, I'm not really the best person. And I think there's a I guess what I'm saying is I think there's always a recognition that in any writing, and
Yeah.
maybe you could say in any speaking and podcasting, in any way of kind of putting words and expression in the world that reflect your thoughts, feelings, ideas, that there is an egoism, involved. And you're here to talk about the divine names.
Hmm.
Uh, there's dangers, always in the narcissism of, kind of like thinking that, well, what I have to say should be very important. There's a self-conscious attempt to acknowledge that, but it is also a topos because they go on to write these books, and many of them are, very productive writers who've written hundreds of works, and so clearly they
Yeah.
were able to get over
Yeah.
the humility topos, and maybe it was just a topos for some. But in this topic in specific, I felt there was a resonance of
Yeah.
something kind of serious that they were adjusting themselves to. So maybe it's worth looking a little bit at
Yeah.
these openings a little more closely. I don't know
Yeah.
which one you might want to start with, Mark.
Well, do you want to say something about Ghazali? Because he clearly tells his reader, I really would rather have not written this book about the names.
Yeah.
And people might, and I think this, if we're thinking about our audience right now, this is really all about the question of how do even figures who are considered like eminent in this tradition, how they're positioning themselves. What's the right adab if you're in an Islamic context? What's the right etiquette? What's the right attitude to have to even talking about the transcendent, about the divine? So this is what they're grappling with. And I do take it, like you do, as something sincere, not just a rhetorical.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I
Yeah.
do. I had to acknowledge that the genre is that somebody, that you find a lot of these kinds of
Yeah,
statements, but
sure.
I really
Sure.
did feel this. They were working through something. Even the invocation. If we turn to at least this translation by David Burrell and Nazih Daher of al-Ghazali's treatise that we had introduced last episode. Um, it starts with this, hummed praise to God. Even there is kind of a unique and interesting and very poetic kind of image that is part of this cautionary sense of the awesomeness of what you're approaching, to try and speak about.
Hmm.
That invokes praise to God alone in his majesty and his might, and unique in his sublimity and his everlastingness, who clips the wings of intellects well short of the glow of his glory, and who makes the way of knowing him pass through the inability to know him,
Yeah.
who makes the tongues of the eloquent fall short of praising the beauty of his presence, unless they use the means by which he praises himself, and use his names and attributes which he has enumerated. And may blessings be upon Muhammad, the best of his creatures, and on his companions and his family. So already in that first like praise invocation, he set up a problem. It's not just praise God for being creator of the world and so on, but in fact, actually the very attempt to approach speaking about God can't proceed for al-Ghazali entirely as an intellectual project, because that is bound to fail. Like the wings of the intellect can only go so high, and they're clipped. So it's a little Icarus, kind of situation. Like, be careful of flying so high on the wings of the intellect, because there's, kind of shortcomings that will become apparent at that point. But he also says that the problem of expression is a clear one, because eloquence will fall short of really being able to put into language. And so what you actually have to do, according to him, is use the name. So the study of the names is in a way the only tool that's available for the praise of God and for knowing God. But I found it very interesting that there was already presented the puzzle that the goal, which might be, in a theological sense of knowing God, and of course we always should remember that he who knows himself knows his Lord. And that's the self reflexive kind of component and dimension of the theomorphic character of the human that we were interested in studying how these names relate to the human kind of process of spiritual realization and fulfillment. Is that if your goal is to know him and thus, know yourself in terms of reversing the direction here, is that you have to first go through not knowing. And I think that's a kind of curious sort of suggestion that the mystery of oneself, the mystery of God is actually an important part of the process and the progress. Okay, great. Well, so why don't we proceed? What I, really did was sort of talk about that first paragraph. And a couple of the paradoxes there, including that the path towards knowing God came via first not knowing, and
Yeah.
the paradox there. That's sort of a mystery, and also relating it to the point that to know oneself is to know your Lord, and if to know God is to know yourself in a way, right? Like the corollary. Maybe you have some thoughts also. Sorry.
On Ghazali.
Yeah, on that first part, yeah. Before we get into his hesitation about even writing, but just because he says something interesting there about that the names are in fact actually the only vehicle that you could use, right? It's like you can't really put God into language, but you could use what God has used already, i.e. Quranic self-description and the names. Those are the tools by which you can know these things. Everything else is probably, that you might use from other sources is not going to be sufficient. And so I was trying to think, maybe I was trying to anticipate how you might look at interpreting that set of characteristics that he's mentioning here about the problem of language and reason.
Yeah. So I think it's quite clear, and here there will be some common ground with Tilimsani, for whom Ghazali is one of the authorities. Clearly, he mentions him by name on the first page of his book, that one's own reason is not capable of even addressing these names on its own. And that's what I get from part of this introductory piece of Ghazali's. And I do believe he was reluctant to write it. I take that at face value.
Right. Well, that's what he says right after that. In the very next line is now a brother in God, great and glorious, to answer whom is a religious duty. Okay, so if you have somebody who asks you for spiritual or religious advice and you have knowledge about it, okay, it's some obligation to share that knowledge. Doesn't belong to you, it's for the benefit of all. So he's framing that, well, it's a duty, to actually, if asked, has asked me to elucidate the meanings of the most beautiful names of God. His questions were incessant. Okay, so he tried to put him off, but they were incessant. Now you're wondering about the adab of the brother, perhaps a little bit, if you've been given polite excuses, but, he's insistent and made me take one step forward and another backward, hesitating between heeding his inquiry and so satisfying the duty of brotherliness, or declining his request by following the way of caution and
Right.
deciding not to venture into danger, for human powers fall far short of attaining this goal.
Right.
Right? Yeah.
Well, right. I mean, it's so there's caution for the sake of what do I as a human being have to say about the names of God. But also, if I remember correctly, al-Ghazali is also concerned because he knows what he's going to be saying is going to upset people. So if I remember correctly, he says, "Hey, I'm going to be critiquing, in so many words, what most people think they know about the names."
Yes. And he
And he
gets
says,
to
I do
that.
think he says most, right?
Well, he does. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
Well, he says the collectivity, and he's meaning maybe the consensus. So, but he first,
Okay.
before he even gets there, though, he does say like it's such a high, unattainable thing that it's really
Sure.
difficult anyway. And he has
Sure.
a beautiful sort of line. He says, "Can the eyes of bats tolerate the light of the sun?" Right?
Sure. Sure.
That's that one component. But then he says, just as you were remembering, um, declaring the essence of the truth of this matter all but contradicts whatever the collectivity has hitherto believed. That is, like whatever the ummah or the consensus of the scholars, that whatever the truth of the matter, if you actually discover the truth of the meanings of these names and what the attributes are, that it may in fact go against what people think they know about them or believe about them. And so that's a concern, that you're going to have to deal with people being perturbed and discomfited by the reality.
Or
Um,
angry and offended. I mean, I
yeah,
think,
that's
I
true
wouldn't
too.
minimize that. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, sure. And I think that's reasonable. I think getting into this territory, we can expect the same. Why not?
Okay.
I'm
Well,
not pretty. It could happen.
it could happen. I mean, the nobler the thing sought after, the less help there is. And so that's also the kind of component of it, is that, if you go deeply into and make progress in discovering these meanings, you don't have a community necessarily of support that says yes and validates exactly what you're saying and experiencing and feeling about these things. And so you are having to be brave in some sense to go where the experience is taking you.
That's right. And what I do genuinely love about this combination is that the concern is in both directions. It's vertical, but it's also horizontal. It's also among the human beings that he lives among. There's the concern, like I want to have the right relationship with the divine to even dare to speak about this. Uh, my understanding is not entirely up to me. It's not up to me fully. I have to rely on God to be able to talk about this. This is how part of how I read him. And I'm running a risk by talking about it at all. On the ground, I'm running a risk. And I think that humanizes Ghazali's situation considerably for me if I really let that in. So I appreciate that.
Well, yeah, and I like that because, when you read most of his work and the rest of the text, I mean, there's a lot of very authoritative, kind of
Sure.
sounding
Sure.
exposition. But you have to remember that this is happening in the context of somebody who is, going into territory that is risky in some sense, intellectually,
Yeah.
spiritually, and socially. And it reminds me so much of not quite a contemporary, a later scholar, Ibn Tufayl, Andalusian, like the Tlimsani, but earlier,
Yeah.
who wrote a very famous book, Hayy ibn Yaqzan,
Right.
Awake, Son of the Alive, is the direct translation of it. And it's an allegory for acquiring spiritual and philosophical truth, in a scenario. It's kind of a philosophical fiction where a baby uh, arrives. There's two
Yeah.
ways the baby, emerges, but probably the more common feeling is that the baby is put in a boat, arrives on a deserted island with no other human beings, and the story kind of follows how they begin to reason through and experience, apprehending truth and acquiring knowledge, and they come to a state of being able to apprehend the real, understand truth in a philosophically rigorous way. And then somebody arrives on the island and discovers this semi-miraculous case of a person who, with no human assistance or help, actually arrived at this deep philosophical understanding, and says, "Oh, you should come back to the civilized, inhabited island and share this knowledge and your methods with people." And he does so, but it just causes concern. It shakes people's belief.
Yeah.
It sows
Yeah.
dissension,
Yeah.
a variety of responses. And so he then decides, okay, It's better for you to believe as you believe. You're sincere believers, how you believe, and decides not to contribute to disturbing people's
Yeah.
sense of reality and withdraws and goes back to his island alone, right? So it's sort of the
Lots of echoes of Plato's cave
right. Get back in the
in
cave.
all of these stories, and Ghazali with the bat and the sun flying into the sun as well. So yeah, yeah.
I think the point there, is that al-Ghazali probably also, as you were saying, a double kind of move is he doesn't want to disturb others. It's not only just that people won't understand what I have to say, but that this can contribute to people being confused. And it reminds me so much also of Maimonides. Like he'd addressed his Dalalat al-Ha'irin. I mean, it's for
Yeah,
the perplexed. How did these people become perplexed? It's because they're good
yeah,
rabbinical students and scholars and pious, Jewish religious scholars who come into contact with philosophy and start having questions that they can't answer,
yeah,
various kinds of doubts. And what he's trying to do is bring them to a position where those doubts and confusion can be resolved, where you're still able to keep your faith, but also understand the place of some of these philosophical truths and spiritual,
yeah,
understandings that might not be so common.
yeah. Well, true. I mean, I think Maimonides also was like harshly criticized after publishing that book by co-religionists, right? And I think maybe one of the most dramatic differences between us and our like modest, let's say, effort to talk about this online together. One of the most dramatic differences is these medieval figures believed Maimonides is a great example. Only a very, very small percentage of people they thought should really even be opening up these questions. Whereas apparently we think we can put it on the internet.
the, Either the arrogance or the foolishness of the moderns and the postmoderns. I mean, that is like such
Yeah,
a great point and observation, because these were very elitist sort of texts, and there is this kind of esoteric, exoteric kind of division, that, okay, we have to,
yeah,
especially for these religions that have very serious religious law and social commitments for regulation and ordering society in a certain way on these principles
yeah,
and so forth, is, okay, you have to do, what you must to adhere to the consensus tradition in your life, but then there might be these things you're exploring inwardly that might seem to be contradictory or confusing or open you to, all kinds of charges of, you know
heresy.
blasphemy
Let's say
and
heresy.
these kinds of,
Yeah,
kinds of concerns and questions. So that should be
yeah,
reserved just for the few who have the capacity to reconcile these things. And
yeah,
that goes against our kind of modern sensibility, and I would say my sense, and I have a real faith in this process, that I actually think that people coming to this uh, podcast and to this topic and
yeah,
question with good faith and openness of mind and heart are going to find that, of course, there may be many things that don't make sense to you or cause you to think, more, or that you might dismiss. But you're coming because you feel like there might be something rewarding for you, spiritually, psychologically, intellectually, however you're engaging.
yeah,
And so, whatever it is that we can do to make this more available to encourage people to engage and be reflective, I think that's fine. I don't think actually I expect very many people who aren't actually interested in their own kind of progress and engagement and learning to really come here.
Well, yeah, but even beyond that, I think the point you're making is so important. Like this is an invitation to witness a conversation and to be part of that conversation, so good faith is the foundation of all of that, like you said, and value obviously clearly a value of mine too, and why you and I are here together, uh, and without clearly without a demand, without a claim to be speaking in the authoritative voice, if there is such a thing, about the names, but rather to open up the subject to a multiplicity of perspectives on it, and then that being intrinsically enriching, and an expression of care. Let's put it that way.
I like that. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good way
So
to.
that's where we're both coming from.
Yeah. But there are some who, may have had an even more ambitious appeal for aid, let's say, in this awesome task of embarking upon such a kind
Yeah.
of weighty and important task of like studying the divine through the names and the attributes, and particularly doing so by looking very carefully at the mentions, the sort of divine self-descriptions that you find in the scriptural text of the Quran.
Sure.
Tilimsani is a pretty interesting approach in his kind of invocation that also
Yeah.
reflects some of these qualms, but maybe in a slightly different way.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, something that you're alluding to as well is both Ghazali and Tlimsani are writing these books in order to provide assistance for people in their worship. And we're not in that position with respect to our audience, but rather opening up the whole field of relating to the names, not giving direction in worship as the two of them were. But having said that, let's talk about Tilimsani a little bit, because before we began the recording, I was sharing with you one of the most important. Now, Tilimsani, just to remind our listeners, was in the first generation of inheritors of Ibn al-Arabi, studied with Ibn al-Arabi personally, and then even more so with Qunawi, Ibn Arabi's successor. And he writes a book on the divine names. And within the first page, he says, I seek protection from God for my own statements in order that he be the speaker. And he goes on, but so I seek protection from God from my own statements in order that he, God, be the speaker. So what could he possibly mean by that? And I do, this reflects how the Akbaris viewed the way in which a human being could become, through the meditative path, more transparent so that their actions are a vehicle for the divine, so that they're being acted through. So what he's asking for is a degree of connection. This is how I'm interpreting him, of course, but he's asking for a degree of transparency to an intentionality that's larger than his own, so that what he communicates in this book, which is going to be quite a lengthy commentary on the names as they show up in the Quran, so that what he says is in harmony with and inspired by a larger intentionality than his limited personal one. So this is already saying, now I'm putting this out, I'm sort of describing it in this sense as a phenomenologist, remember. So in other words, I'm, by describing it this way, it's not to say, oh, hey, that's the fact of what happened in the Middle Ages. You must agree that this is what was going on with Tlimsani. No, I'm saying this is the experience that he's speaking from, is that this was going on for him. So if we take the classical Sufi text like this as a record of a lived experience, then the least we can say is that for Tlimsani, if we take him seriously, this is what he was reporting he was seeking to be in harmony with, based on the fact that he knew such a thing was possible personally. And we don't have to agree or disagree with that, but I think we can read him in that light. Make sense to you, Adnan?
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective, and I think it's just quite interesting how he sets up what he thinks is the problem there. Like that's already kind of interesting. That
Yeah.
why would you seek protection? Okay, so like there's some risk or danger or some concern, and it's also a desire for rigor and to really be on the straight path, like he's going to be starting with the very first chapter, the opening surah of the Quran,
Yeah.
the Fatiha, the opening, where one of the most important kind of verses in this very short chapter um, is, guide me along the straight path, like, so he's concerned that um, he continue to stay on it, which does remind us a little bit of al-Ghazali's concern that, most people will probably, from what they know and understand to be the maybe orthodox formulation of belief and creedal statements and theology, that
Mm.
anytime you're talking about the divine in this sort of way, through these attributes, and trying to connect the seeker after spiritual truth to the path towards those, it raises up all kinds of crucial questions and issues that he's here seeking, from my own statements. Like, what he wants the authority of saying that whatever it is that I might come up with, I want them to be grounded in an experience that I'm more sure is actually flowing from the truth of these names and the truth of a real connection and experience with God, right? And not just kind of maybe what al-Ghazali himself was also concerned about, with simple rational kinds of exposition and what you might be able to construct for yourself that is divorced in an abstract way from genuine phenomena and genuine experience of those phenomena.
Yeah, exactly. So, and as a phenomenological psychologist, again, since that's the background I bring to this, the way I read Tlimsani is he as a person knows implicitly, he knows the difference between acting in a way that's merely personal. This is what I want to do. This is what I want to say, versus acting in a way that is in continuity or even contiguous with something larger, with a larger wanting to say, a larger wanting to be known. So to me, that's, again, taking him seriously. That's an experiential distinction that's implied in what he's saying here. This is the way I want. This is the position that I'm seeking, that I'm praying to be in as I write. That's where it needs to come from, because both are possible for him. Both are possible.
Right, right. And also, like al-Ghazali, but maybe with slightly different emphasis, there is a kind of concern about the insufficiency of language, or at least the gap between the word or the name as a word and the essence
Yeah,
to which it refers. So that he says
yeah. Great.
here, these words issue from a presence through which the divine name is concealed in what it names, and in which the meaning encompasses its word, not the word its meaning.
Yeah, so important. Great. I'm so glad you zeroed in on that. What do you want to say about that? We can go back and
Well, I
forth.
was interested in what you might want to say in terms of the kind of
Yeah,
way there's a phenomenon that
yeah,
it's not just a kind of language is slippery and insufficient. There's something else
that's right.
being posited here when he says a presence through which the
That's
divine
right. So
is
that's
concealed in.
right. That's right. Exactly. So these words, the quality of attunement, or the experiential quality of connection to God that he is describing, is one in which the words are coming from a hadrat, right?
Mm-hmm,
In this case,
mm-hmm.
from a presence. So
Right.
this is not just conceptual. He's talking about a presence from which these words are coming, and okay, so how is that recognizable? Well, because the name is concealed in what it names. So what's being named is the most evident. What's being named is what's being manifested. And in other words, the meaning encompasses its word, not the word its meaning. So this is not a book where, I don't know, I'll take a run at this, and then you do your commentary. This is not a cognitive achievement. This is not going to be a sequence of words where the word is what's most important. It's the presence of the named that is meant to stand out in this work that he's giving us. Not so the presence of what the words are pointing to is what the reader is intended to experience.
Yes, I agree. See, because, and he does use the word hadra. You were absolutely right. The presence.
Yeah,
Um, so some sense of the actual being, right, and contact with that, the itself. And I think what really demonstrates, or at least validates, that interpretation that you had actually is his next line, because I think it really picks up on the next implication of this, which is the starting point of this breath is Sufism, is tasawwuf, right?
yeah, yeah.
And its end point is beyond recognition. Okay, so I think that's he's signaling that it isn't really a question of, say, theological kind of attempts at theological reasoning through it,
That's right.
uh, right? You know, understanding the word, you may have to do all of those things, but
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
not itself really the goal. The goal of like learning and understanding the names is not to understand them as intellectual objects, though that may help, that may facilitate, may provide certain
right,
resonances, may be
right.
doors through which, like, you know, understanding that knowledge get you to the hadra, right, to the actual presence and experience of what this reality is specifying, right? Because I
Yeah,
think that's what's also interesting or important, really. And in a moment, I think because we've been doing a lot of very abstract kind of discussion, in a moment we might go into just, especially for readers who are not so familiar with this tradition, just saying, well, what are some of these names and some of their broad
yeah,
features? But that
yeah.
the point there is that, you know, it's uh that these are kind of and this is also part of my qualms, like, you know, trying to talk about these things, is this is directed toward a conceptual feeling anyway of the infinite, and yet ironically the whole point of the names and the attributes is that they are some kind of specification of that infinite. They are both infinite, but they are like, otherwise you would just have one name, you know, Allah. You know, we haven't talked about you know, that
Yeah,
name, but you know, which contains all of these components and dimensions. But there's something specific about
yeah.
each of these names and attributes, and yet at the same time they are also tending towards some infinitude, right? So
Well,
um,
yeah, and great. And you know, if you who are watching this are getting lost in how come these guys are reading line by line, like what's happening here? So part of what we're the point that we're right on right now is in reading this Sufi book. It's not a book in the sense that we're used to thinking about books today. I guess I want to make that claim. Like what Adnan and I are talking about at the moment is what the author here, Tlimsani, is saying is this is not a sequence of words where the word is the most important thing. This book about the names is meant as a series of events that engages the reader in the event of encountering the names. So let that sink in, because we live in a time, I would say, Adnan, this is something else you and I have been talking about lately. We live in a time where a computational model of consciousness is pretty dominant, where we sort of are educated to think that what's going on in our heads is just information processing. That's not the world that Tlimsani or Ghazali are inhabiting, and even more so in this book. So it's the named that is supposed to stand out. The event of meeting a name, whether it's Rahman, whether it's the Merciful, whether it's the knower, whether it's the friend, whether it's the loving or the lover. All of these are names, and I know you want to get to the names. I do too. Some of the names, but I think I really do feel like there's something critical that I hope we can get across about just how different the implications are in in encountering this kind of tradition of the names or literature about the names it's implicitly experiential. It's about an event that one undergoes in encountering the names, not just a conceptual understanding.
That's so well observed and said, I think. I mean, there is the whole larger question, I would say, of any Sufi literature is I think we even referred to it last time, is that it's all about the dhawq, the tasting of the experience. And so
Yeah,
what is it that
yeah,
they're doing when they're writing? Because they say, well, look, words are insufficient and our exposition here is really just meant to be glimpses or hints and allusions or provocations for you to recall, um, uh, because in fact it is about the experience. And yet there's so much Sufi writing that has been so powerful and
right,
important for people
right.
on their spiritual kind of path of awareness and self-knowledge and discovery. And so I think maybe one way, I think what you've done is you've kind of resolved one paradox that I've often had and wrestled with, which is that it is the encounter, as you're saying, of the names and the spiritual and psychological and phenomenological realities of experiencing those names as you encounter them in this context, which is not necessarily the same as how people may come to experience and encounter them in other forms of spiritual engagement and knowing, which may be through, meditation and like some sense of a name coming to your consciousness in a powerful way
Hmm.
through your own practice of self examination and meditation. Or maybe it'll come in a more visceral, not really visceral, but in a kind of visual, powerful way in dream, in vision. This is the stuff through which people process and engage with their own psychological and spiritual realities. And so the names may, at different times, a different name may reveal itself as important somehow, as
Yeah,
an attribute. That will happen not necessarily in the textual reading and encounter, but I think the textual reading and encounter, the purpose of these books are meant to try and stimulate not a kind of knowledge of the names in the way, say, a theological book might do it, but as you're saying, having an encounter
yeah,
with them. That's a
yeah.
really good way, I think, to think about it. But
Great.
maybe we should get to some of them. We've been kind of moving in this little dance around them. Partly because, as we've explained from the top, about the tradition that we are fitting ourselves into as we find ourselves having our hesitations and preparations and needing to
Yeah,
frame this, the space mentally to go into this journey. Um, but now I think maybe we're at least ready to let listeners hear a little bit about some of these names, so that those, especially who aren't so familiar with them, and even for people who know this tradition, maybe to clear themselves for a kind of fresh encounter with them. So
sure.
just to have some of the sounds and the kind of translations of them, is that the Asma al-Husna, the beautiful names, traditionally 99. There are different arrangements of them, but one of the most common devotional arrangements of them, of the 99, begins with Ar-Rahman, the merciful, the all merciful; Ar-Rahim, the all beneficent; al-Malik, the absolute kind of ruler or possessor or king, the Lord; al-Quddus, the pure one; as-Salam, peace, the source of peace; um, al-Mu'min, al-Muhaymin, the inspirer of faith, the guardian; al-Aziz, the victorious or the mighty. And so it goes on like this for 99, but there are some that are um, almost kind of opposites, that I think are also fascinating to pay attention to, or that seem to be contradictory. Like, how is God al-Hakim, the judge; al-Adil, the just. So ones that have this capacity for justice, and it's and judgment. When he is, when God is also understood through these names and attributes to be, al-Ghaffar, the forgiving, al-Ghafur, the all forgiving. Um, how does one kind of reconcile and deal? We also have al-Jabbar, the
Hmm.
one that punishes. That's one of the kind of features. But you also have the Merciful, ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, that we were just
Yeah.
talking about. So sometimes these are characterized and as names that reflect the Jamal, the beauty, and there is of course the very famous, I believe, Quranic phrase, Allahul Jamil wa yuhibbul Jamal. God
Yeah.
is beautiful and loves beauty. So the Jamal, Jamali, the beautiful, and of course these are meant to be the beautiful names, but husna, or at least good names, good and beautiful. But then there are some that are, about God's majesty and might, and reflect these jalali, these sort of heavy, kind of awe-inspiring, or uh, kind of severe, even kind of qualities and attributes. So it's not that there's just a dichotomy, and very often the antinomies, the Jamal and the Jalal, these are actually kind of often paired with one another in
Right.
the recitations, um, to be kind of these two faces, or two facets, um, complementary, opposing. I'm wondering if you have any, kind of thoughts or comments, as we're just giving a sort of general overview, particularly about these
Sure.
Jamal and Jalal qualities.
Sure. Sure. Well, if we imagine these names as the full palette of through which the creator is manifesting existence, then how and why there would be such a dramatic range of qualities, I think, mm, makes more sense. Seems why there would be seeming opposites. Why there would need to be actually that full range of compelling and as you well know, there's there's a whole lengthy commentary on his mercy, uh, mercy transcending his wrath. So because some of these names on the face of it are quite wrathful, right? As well. But I think
When we get to the first name, probably the first name we will deal with that is a specified attribute will be ar-Rahman. It's the first one that I think our treatise that follows incidents or appearance in the Quran will really deal with, and that is, of course, the merciful, the beneficent, and that is considered prior to anything. It is like a very fundamental. In fact, of course, there was the verse, I believe, that we talked about before, the call upon me uh, by the name of Allah or Ar-Rahman,
right.
right? I mean, it sort of puts it almost equivalent, as a
Yeah.
separate kind of necessary principle of worship is knowing and addressing oneself to mercy.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. And we'll see. Probably we'll come to this in a future episode. How for the Akbaris, the Rahman, the mercy, is almost equivalent to manifestation itself. That the manifestation of creation by God or by the divine is itself understood as an expression of mercy spreading outward and through existence. So yeah, it's right at the beginning, and right at the beginning for Tlimsani also.
yes. And yet, as you point out, though, there is an opposition. There are many of these oppositions, and it just reminds me that um, that's in some ways what some of the theologians have always, even in the Latin tradition, Latin Christian tradition of theology, have theorized is one of the components for understanding God as the, coincidentia oppositorum, the place where
Yeah.
these paradoxes no longer are apparent paradoxes, but they are resolved. It's where the opposing and contradictory things come together
Yeah.
in some way. And so those are really, I think it's interesting because those are really truthful. I mean, even if we look at it from the perspective of psychology and like the theomorphic component and the phenomenological dimension for the
Yeah.
person, the human, is that it's not possible to just kind of talk about like our wholesome natures and you know we're to only too aware, of course, of the forces that take us tend towards destruction or
Yeah.
retribution and so on, and these are all realities that it doesn't make sense on a genuine kind of spiritual path to just ignore. They can't be
Yeah.
ignored. They have to be worked through in their reality.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. No, I'm glad you went there because, yeah, if we turn this upside down and say, well, okay, if these divine names are the ingredients for creation, well, okay, down here it's not all sweetness and light at all. On the contrary, it's like a horror show much of the time, and we're looking for some light, let's say. So how is it that this full range, including the opposites, is constitutive or formative of we down here, us down here, right? I think I'm jumping ahead maybe of where we are going to be today, but if the names are constitutive of us, then the shadow has to be there too, and the harshness has to be there as well as the gentleness. The latif is there, but also the compeller must be there somehow.
mhm, mhm.
Otherwise, this would be a picture that's split off from not just our experience today, but going back to the time of the prophet. I mean, the world that we've lived in, it's not a world. It's a rough,
Yes.
plenty of tragedy in it.
Oh, absolutely. And of our own devising very often. I mean, that just always, I always come back to just the reminder of like the angels. They really had us sussed out, on some level, and yet that kind of truth that they had about us, their indictment, would you put on the earth, in your
Yeah,
creation, you know, uh,
we should
uh,
make that explicit because there may be viewers who don't know that story as we
well,
do
if
the Quranic story.
I should have that verse memorized, but I'll just have to summarize it. But it's in one of the early passages, if you were to look in the Quran in the second surah, that talks about creation, the creation of humankind, is that the angels complain about the creation of Adam and Eve and say, look, we always praise you constantly, unceasingly. We call you holy, but now you've created a creature that you will put upon the earth, who will sow corruption and bloodshed.
Hmm.
I mean, they have these specific charges like fasad fil ard, corruption of the earth,
Yeah,
corruption of the land, and sfaka dima. They will like spill blood. They will commit violence, and these are, of course, um, prescribed things. I mean, these are unholy things. So we call you holy, but you're creating a creature that will have these capacities for destruction
yeah,
and wreak havoc with your beautiful creation. And God says, I know what you know not. Like, I have some other mission. There is like a reality or a capacity for humankind to be the true stewards of the earth. Khilafa, it says, is put us upon
yeah,
the earth
yeah,
as khulafa, right? That, you
yeah,
know, uh, stewards or deputies. But, you have to say that human history, as a historian, that sometimes you wonder, it seems like the angels might have been right about us. And so actually the process of the
Yeah.
discovery of the names are to actually try and fulfill that promise the divine said, that I know something about the human creation and the human capacity that isn't available to those who just have no capacity for error, and are only devoted to God, but that there is something about the condition of forgetfulness, heedlessness in like our worldly existence, that can be redeemed and is redemptive in the act of returning to recalling our true natures, in the way that we're created and exist as human beings with this divine spark of spiritual knowledge and understanding. There's something there, that and that is similarly that dialectic kind of dimension, that is always mentioned in these treatises, that the Hadith Qudsi, and I think we may have mentioned it, that in one of these characterizations where God describes himself, but it's not actually a Quranic text. It's something that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is said to have reported that God said, but it's not Quranic revelation. That I was a hidden treasure and wanted to be known, right?
Yeah. Or
And
love to be
that's what
known.
creation is to do, is to have that dialectical distance
Yeah.
where it can't be
Yeah.
known until there is, self and other, like that. You can't, knowledge is only something that
Yeah.
can exist through that process.
Yeah. Now we're in the deep water. So
Yeah.
now we're into the creation of the human being who is somehow endowed with some combination of these names in some form, uh, with the intention of becoming like a fuller or more complete human, or a perfect human, if you prefer that language, which is somehow to realize the endowment of these attributes in us, uh, despite or along with the whole horror show that we've been that we've been talking about. Um, yeah. So I think this is why you and I started last time with the idea of the Insan al-Kamil, the complete human being or the perfect human, um, particularly within Sufism, within Islamic mysticism. What is that picture of complete or completing human being, that of which the names are the ingredients, we could say.
Right, right.
The place of manifestation for those names is the human being. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that's I think the way to frame it. I mean, that's a perfect segue. I don't know if we want to take it just yet, but it's a perfect segue to actually some response to comments that we got on the first episode.
Yeah.
Before we do get into that, I did just want to say about this kind of overview, just to give people a sense of the names, is that, other examples of the oppositions that aren't really so obviously jamali and jalali, kind of beauty and majestic, are things like al-akhir, the last, al-awwal, the first,
Hmm.
al-zahir, the manifest one, al-batin, the hidden one, right? So these are just conscious oppositions that are often paired together, so that devotionally, if you're reciting the 99 names and you go through them, you go through these oppositions that are of pairings. And so that's also worthwhile kind of knowing and understanding. But, you know, the more important point is just what you were talking about there, Mark, which is our sense of how these are part of a process of completion and fulfillment of what it really means to be human. And you introduced the Akbarian formulation of the Insan al-Kamil, al-Insan al-Kamil, the
Yeah.
complete, or sometimes people translate it as perfected
Yeah.
human being. Well, sometimes they say the perfect man, and I think that's just awful, because come on, Insan is like universal, human. Um, but we had a couple of
Hmm.
comments address themselves, listeners who clearly know something of the tradition, and said, well, what about, kind of you called it complete human, or that was a formulation you used. Why didn't you use, we prefer, the perfect human, or the
Hmm.
perfected human? I thought it was worth spending a moment or two on the clarifications that we gave, each individually. And I just thought
Hmm.
maybe you might want to start with like why you prefer thinking about this goal or object of being an Insan al-Kamil,
Yeah.
as being a complete human.
I think because to be, it's a great question. So I'm glad the question came up because most of the time, I think you will find the word perfect in, as an English translation of for the perfect human. But in English, at least, that has a very static connotation. It sounds like done. And it also, whereas what I know of the Akbari tradition, Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi and his inheritors, is it's the opposite of static. The picture that's being given of the human being in process toward greater completion. Um, and so when Ibn Arabi talks about those who uh, he considers most advanced or most complete, they're people without a fixed station, la makam. So they're people without a fixed station, spiritual station, right? So that, and this is all over a lot of the scholarship. So to look, there's plenty of references for that in the translations of Ibn al-Arabi. So what does that imply? It implies that the greater completion in the human being, at least from the perspective of Akbari Sufism, the less static is the human being in that completion. And that's why, to be honest, I would even prefer the completing human being rather than the complete, because even complete seems to me to have too much of a period at the end of that word somehow. That's me, but I think it's in alignment with what the picture is that comes out of that tradition. And then again, like the Akbaris are not the only ones who are going to use that phrase. Even Maimonides, actually, in the Guide to the Perplexed, which was as we were talking about it before we started recording, was written in Arabic, of course, the guide uses the phrase "the complete human" in Arabic in there too. So this is not just narrowly a Sufi expression, but uh, okay, maybe you didn't need that footnote. But I'm trying to acknowledge it's not the only way you could translate that, but for sure, I believe the Akbarians would say it's the opposite of static, and that's why I tend to go for complete rather than perfect.
Well, or maybe you're right, completing that sense of unfinished as a constant process, right? Of working to be fully human in the most complete capacity you're capable of at that moment. But there always is more to discover and to
Yeah,
achieve.
yeah. And as you and I discussed, like if you want even one more sort of data point about Ibn al-Arabi, in his lexicon of Sufi terms, he says, well, for us, okay, there's tamkin, which is a spiritually establishment, and there's talween, which is variegation, right? And he says most will say that the stability, the tamkin, is the highest level. For us, the variegation is the highest. In fact, we aim at stability in variegation. So this is very challenging idea. But
Yes, of
that's where he is.
constant change. Right. Yes. Well, I mean, this is very Akbarian in the sense that, also on the like more cosmological level, like, the interpretation of the uh, uh, self-description of God as al-Khaliq, the creator.
Mm-hmm.
It is an active participle. And for the Akbarians, it's not that creation happened and now we recognize the creator, but that actually the act of creation is continuous, constant, always involved in creation. You might say creation and destruction and recreation, and it's a
Yeah.
constant
Right.
process
Right.
that's happening. It's not something that is, as you were saying, static and completed. And so that's, I think, a really interesting, point to think about when you wonder what is the project of human kind of spiritual and fulfillment of what it means, is that that's an unfinished and always changing discovering process. But there were other reasons for me why I prefer complete to perfect. In some sense, complete or completing is about the boundedness in some sense. We were just saying, well, it's infinite, but it's within its bounded condition of being human.
Sure.
It's and in this world, human. And I don't think that any of the Sufi theosophists would characterize what the nature of human existence is as infinite, right? I mean, there may be infinite inward states and components, but like we're in a bounded finite kind of existence, in some sense. And so perfect is something that tends to my mind towards like this uh, impossible, okay,
Yeah.
impossible sort of achievement. But also, that uh, I was also thinking that perfect has also got a kind of hierarchical sort of sensibility,
Mm.
of superiority.
Ah,
Whereas complete is just being whole.
yeah.
Like, even the word for Islam and salam, one of the divine names, salam, the source of peace, kind of the ontology of peace, um, uh, Islam comes from the name of the religion and the appropriate state of the believer. Salim also means whole or complete,
Mm.
healthy, like properly arranged and constituted, sound, right?
Hmm.
In its construction, it's balanced appropriately, it's integral, integrated. And so complete gets more at that kind of same sensibility rather than a hierarchical of the perfect or the imperfect. Incomplete doesn't have any moral valence other than that you're attempting to be more complete. But perfection gives a certain superiority and is very hierarchical, and it just seemed like I would prefer to think of the project here as not necessarily trying to instantiate hierarchies, but rather the universal openness of what it means to be human is possible for everyone. It's just that we don't do it. So let's try and do it. Um,
Amen.
so so those were some reflections that we had, but
Yeah.
again, it was a great question, and we
Yeah.
loved that. I liked that it actually, I had sort of unconsciously preferred that, and I didn't necessarily know how to articulate why until I had to. And I loved the question because it made me think a little bit. And now, looking at your kind of response, I think even completing is better, or at least we should have that as a sense and meaning in it. But it allowed me to think of what's at stake in each of these translations, and acknowledging that any translation into English may not fully grasp the conceptual range and resonance of the Arabic frame or phrase, particularly as it's used in some of these Sufi theosophical writers who have a very kind of complex and various way of using, language. So, but it allowed me to clarify something that I was
Yeah.
only inchoate or implicit in my own thinking, and so I so much appreciate that from the listener to engage and give us that opportunity.
Agree.
Well, listeners, this has been, I think, a pretty full discussion overall about some important features and components of orienting ourselves before we take the plunge into exploring a particular name. Um, so look forward to that in our next episode, where we'll actually grapple with the meanings and possible experiences and resonances with one of the really foundational divine names. And I'm not committing to whether it will be yeah, the kind of summative name of Allah or God, the divine name, or ar-Rahman. We'll see what we're kind of in the mood for. And that's very much, I think, the way we're going to proceed is with a trajectory and a direction, but following inspiration, where it takes us, where it leads us in our discussion and interaction together through this material and with you. So hopefully you appreciate um, that kind of style and approach, but I think it's more suitable for the kind of material we're dealing with. So on that note, I want to thank you, Marc, again for a wonderful conversation. And listeners and watchers, peace to you all and solidarity until next time.